When most people think about food, they think only in physical terms. They think about flavor, nutrition, calories, or health. But in the spiritual realm, food goes beyond the flesh. What enters your body has the power to touch your soul, sharpen or dull your spirit, and influence the atmosphere around your life. There are physical foods, and then there are spiritually charged foods. Foods that carry a weight you cannot see with your eyes but feel in your spirit. Many believers struggle in prayer, wrestle with heaviness, or experience unexplained spiritual battles without realizing that what they consume daily might be a doorway affecting their spiritual sensitivity. Spiritual life is delicate, and the inner person must be guarded with great care. What you feed your body shapes the condition of your spirit. The scripture reveals over and over that the physical realm is intimately connected to the spiritual. What you take into your body does not simply disappear. It integrates into your system, impacts your emotions, influences your mental clarity, and ultimately affects your connection with God. Your spirit thrives when your body is treated with honor, purity, and discipline. But your spirit weakens when the flesh dominates, when appetites become uncontrolled, and when food turns from nourishment into a trap. There are foods that carry spiritual consequences, not because of their nutritional value, but because of the influence they exert over the heart. Some foods create physical lethargy that interrupts prayer. Others stir uncontrolled cravings that enslave the mind. Still others carry connections to darkness, rituals, or impurity. People often assume these things don't matter, yet they wonder why their spiritual life feels stuck, why their dreams feel polluted, or why their emotions remain unstable. Everything we do with the body affects the spirit, and food is one of the most underestimated bridges between the natural and the supernatural. Spiritual sensitivity requires a clear mind, a peaceful heart, and a strong inner man. But when food becomes a doorway to distraction, addiction, or spiritual dullness, a believer cannot walk in the fullness of spiritual authority. There are foods that weaken discernment, foods that increase the power of the flesh, foods that intensify emotional storms, foods that reduce your ability to hear God clearly. When the body is weighed down, the soul becomes sluggish, and the spirit loses sharpness. Holiness is not only about what you avoid in behavior, it is about what you allow into your entire being, including what you eat. When your physical appetites rule your decisions, you lose the ability to respond to spiritual promptings. The flesh becomes louder than the spirit, desire becomes stronger than discipline, and you find yourself living at the mercy of impulses rather than wisdom. Many people do not realize that spiritual warfare often begins in the realm of appetite. When the enemy cannot defeat a person with temptation, he often tries to weaken them through indulgence. What you consume physically can either strengthen your spiritual muscles or drain them. Some foods create spiritual heaviness that makes prayer feel difficult. Others cloud the mind until you cannot discern what is happening around you. Food is one of the most powerful symbols of covenant in Scripture. Eating together represented unity, alignment, and agreement. That spiritual principle remains true today. Every time you eat, you are in a form of agreement with what that food represents and what spirit is behind it. Some foods are simply food. Others carry the weight of intention, origin, and influence. Spiritual maturity requires understanding the spiritual meaning behind consumption. Not everything that is allowed is beneficial. Not everything that is available is harmless. Not everything that tastes good is good for your spirit. Your body is meant to be a temple, not a trash can, a place of purity, not confusion, a vessel of strength, not weakness. When you allow unhealthy, spiritually draining, or emotionally destabilizing foods into your life, you unknowingly affect the atmosphere of your inner world. What you consume physically becomes a seed planted in your spiritual soil. Some seeds grow peace, clarity, and focus. Others grow restlessness, anxiety, and spiritual conflict. The enemy knows this, even if people ignore it. That is why the spirit of gluttony exists, not merely to overeat, but to destroy spiritual clarity. Spiritual alertness demands more than prayer and fasting. It also requires daily choices in what you allow into your body. If your spirit feels heavy, if your worship feels shallow, if your dreams feel troubling, or if your prayer life feels weak, examining your physical consumption is a powerful step. Food can open the door to freedom or bondage. It can increase the fire of your spirit or extinguish it. It can lift your emotions or pull them into darkness. It can increase your ability to hear God or surround your mind with noise. This is why self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit. Not because God is trying to deprive you, but because He wants you to walk in spiritual strength. Discipline in eating creates discipline in thinking, discipline in speaking, and discipline in living. When your appetite is under control, your life comes under divine order. When your appetite is out of control, your spiritual life becomes scattered and unfocused. Certain foods affect your spirit, not just your body, because the body itself responds directly to the spiritual atmosphere around it. The enemy often uses the most overlooked areas, like appetite, to gain influence. What begins in the body slowly reaches the emotions, then the mind, and finally the spirit. When you lose control in the physical realm, you weaken your authority in the spiritual realm. But when you guard your body with wisdom, purity, and conviction, your spirit becomes powerful, alert, and sensitive to the voice of God. When you recognize that food is not only a physical choice, but also a spiritual one, you begin to understand why discernment is essential. You begin to notice how certain foods affect your mood, how your thoughts shift after consuming certain things, how your prayer life feels different, how your dreams change, and how your spirit responds. You start to see that your spiritual life is deeply connected to how you treat your body, and that guarding your diet is part of guarding your destiny. There are foods that do more than harm the body. They carry a spiritual atmosphere that clings to the person who eats them. When food is connected to darkness, rituals, curses, or practices that honor anything other than God, it becomes spiritually contaminated. This contamination cannot be seen with the eyes, but it is felt by the Spirit. Many people struggle with unexplained heaviness, confusion, or spiritual oppression because they unknowingly consume things that were offered or dedicated to unclean spiritual forces. What enters your body becomes part of your life, and when food carries a dark spiritual origin, it brings with it a shadow that affects the heart, the mind, and the atmosphere of the home. Throughout history, food has been used not only as nourishment, but as a tool of spiritual alignment. Pagan cultures offered food to idols, spirits, and gods as a form of worship. Even today, in many places around the world, foods are prayed over, spoken over, or spiritually prepared for purposes that do not align with light. When that food is consumed, the eater unknowingly comes into agreement with the intention behind it. Agreement is a spiritual law. Eating food dedicated to darkness is not just a physical act. It is a silent spiritual handshake. It creates a connection, a link, a doorway through which spiritual influence can pass. This is why discernment is essential. Not every food is spiritually neutral. Some foods are intentionally used to carry spiritual assignments. A person may eat a dish and feel a sudden shift in emotions, anxiety, fear, anger, or an unexplained sadness. Others may find their thoughts becoming clouded, their dreams turning dark, or their home feeling heavy. These manifestations are not random. They are spiritual reactions to spiritual contamination. Darkness cannot coexist with light, and when contaminated food enters a body that is meant to carry the presence of God, a spiritual conflict begins. There are regions where witchcraft, sorcery, or ancestral practices involve dedicating food to spirits. People in such cultures often prepare meals not only with ingredients but with intentions. They speak incantations, invite spiritual forces into the food, and offer it as a gateway for influence. Some individuals consume these foods without knowing any better. They wonder why sickness follows them, why their mind becomes troubled, or why their spiritual life becomes weak. The food may taste good, but the spirit behind it is poisonous. What is sweet to the tongue can be bitter to the soul. Even in environments where people do not identify these practices openly, food can still be spiritually charged. A person who hates you can pray over your food. Someone filled with jealousy, anger, or bitterness can prepare food while carrying intentions of harm. Words carry power, and so do the hands that prepare what you eat. When food is handled by someone whose spirit is contaminated, that contamination can transfer. Eating becomes more than nourishment. It becomes participation. This is why it is spiritually wise to bless what you eat, to pray over your meals, and to consecrate your food before consuming it. Prayer breaks contamination. Blessing breaks any hidden assignment. The spiritual authority of a believer is powerful enough to transform what enters their body, but only if they use that authority intentionally. Food sacrificed to darkness also includes substances connected to occult celebrations, festivals rooted in demonic symbolism, or cultural practices that honor spirits rather than God. When a believer participates in such eating, they unknowingly partake in the atmosphere those practices create. Spiritual contamination does not require conscious agreement. Consumption alone can be enough to invite it. You do not have to believe in a curse for it to affect you. You simply have to open the door, and contaminated food is one of the oldest doors the enemy uses. The spirit realm operates through legal rights. What enters your body becomes part of your being, and if that entry comes through food offered to darkness, the enemy uses that moment as a legal opportunity to influence, oppress, or confuse. Many people pray for deliverance without examining what they consume. They ask for peace while eating what produces chaos. They seek clarity while consuming what produces confusion. Removing spiritually dangerous foods is not superstition. It is spiritual wisdom. It is understanding that not every battle is visible, not every threat is physical, and not every attack comes through obvious means. Some attacks come quietly, without warning, through small openings like contaminated food. When you realize this, you begin to take responsibility for your spiritual environment. You become mindful of where your food comes from, who prepares it, and what spiritual atmosphere surrounds it. You start to understand that your body is sacred, and that nothing offered to darkness has permission to dwell in a vessel of light. You become intentional about consecrating what enters your life. You develop a deeper sensitivity to spiritual disturbances after eating certain things. You notice patterns in how certain foods affect your mood, your dreams, your clarity, and your spiritual strength. Avoiding food sacrificed to darkness is not about fear. It is about purity. It is about alignment. It is about protecting your inner world from influences that try to enter unnoticed. When you consume food connected to unclean spiritual origin, you participate in the atmosphere behind it. But when you bless your food, consecrate it, and reject anything that is connected to darkness, you close the door to spiritual contamination and keep your spirit sharp, clear, and strong. There are foods that do far more than satisfy hunger. They awaken desires, agitate emotions, and stir cravings that overpower the spirit. Some foods may seem harmless because they are common, enjoyable, or culturally accepted, but spiritually they are dangerous because of the influence they have over the mind and the heart. When a person consumes something that strengthens the flesh more than the spirit, it creates an imbalance inside them. The inner man becomes weak, while the carnal nature grows stronger, louder, and more demanding. This imbalance becomes a breeding ground for lust, anger, addiction, and emotional instability. The danger lies not simply in the food itself, but in the spiritual reaction it triggers. There are foods that increase heat in the body, foods that awaken uncontrollable cravings, foods that disturb the mind's calmness, and foods that make the emotions more difficult to control. When a person's emotions are stirred in the wrong direction, when cravings become stronger than discipline, when the flesh begins to dominate thoughts and decisions, the spiritual life begins to decline. Lust is fueled when the flesh grows louder, anger intensifies when the body is overstimulated, addiction takes root when the appetite is no longer under control but under bondage. The flesh always desires to rule. It wants to be fed, satisfied, entertained, and indulged. When the flesh grows strong, the spirit becomes quiet. When appetites increase, spiritual desires decrease. People often wonder why their prayer life feels weak, why temptation feels stronger, or why they battle emotions that seem uncontrollable. They look for spiritual reasons while ignoring the physical triggers. But the spirit and the body are deeply connected. What disturbs the body eventually disturbs the soul. What inflames the body eventually inflames the emotions. And what weakens self-control in the physical realm weakens self-control in the spiritual realm. There are foods designed to stimulate the senses beyond what is natural. Additives, chemicals, excessive sugar, artificial enhancers. These are not merely physical ingredients. They are tools the enemy uses in modern times to enslave appetites. When a person becomes dependent on such foods, the flesh gains authority. Addiction does not begin with drugs or alcohol. It begins with undisciplined appetites. When the enemy finds that a person can be controlled through cravings, he uses those cravings to weaken the person's spiritual resilience. A believer who cannot control what enters the mouth will struggle to control what enters the mind. Some foods also trigger mood swings. They create irritability, restlessness, or emotional instability. A person may eat something and suddenly feel angry for no reason, easily irritated, or overwhelmed by feelings they cannot explain. The spiritual danger is not in the food itself, but in the atmosphere it produces inside the body. When emotions become unstable, the door to spiritual warfare swings open. Anger becomes easier. Impulsive decisions become frequent. Lust becomes stronger. Temptation becomes more attractive. The flesh becomes emboldened and begins to demand even more. Lust is not only a spiritual battle, it is also a physical one. When certain foods overstimulate the body, they awaken desires that lie dormant. They produce heat in the body that moves into the emotions. They weaken the boundaries of the mind and loosen the restraints of discipline. Lust becomes strongest when the flesh becomes the master. The danger is not simply the feeling, but the spiritual vulnerability it creates. When a person is consumed by desire, the spirit becomes silent. The voice of wisdom becomes faint, and the person steps into a battlefield unprepared. Addiction is another form of bondage created by the wrong foods. When the body depends on something to feel stable, happy, or satisfied, the enemy gains a foothold. Addiction is not only in the substance, it is in the attachment. It is in the power that substance holds over the mind. Many people are addicted to foods that weaken their spiritual strength. They cannot fast because their cravings dominate them. They cannot pray deeply because the body distracts them. They cannot focus on spiritual things because the flesh screams louder. The body is meant to serve the spirit, not control it. But when food strengthens the flesh, the order is reversed. The spirit becomes a servant and the body becomes the master. This is spiritual danger. When the flesh sits on the throne of your life, lust takes the seat of desire, anger sits in the seat of emotions, and addiction sits in the seat of appetite. The inner man becomes a prisoner of physical impulses instead of a warrior of the spirit. This is why discipline in eating is not only about physical health. It is about spiritual protection. When you control what you eat, you control the flesh. When you control the flesh, you silence lust. When you silence lust, you strengthen the spirit. When you strengthen the spirit, you overcome temptation. Every act of discipline in eating is a declaration that the spirit is stronger than the body. It is a spiritual victory disguised as a physical decision. The foods that fuel lust, anger, and addiction are spiritually dangerous because they shift the authority inside a person. They place power in the wrong hands, the hands of the flesh. A person who cannot master appetite will struggle to master temptation. A person who is ruled by cravings will struggle to be ruled by the spirit. A person who feeds the flesh continually will starve the spirit gradually. The inner battle begins with what we allow into our bodies. If we allow food that excites the flesh will grow stronger. If we allow food that makes the emotions unstable, the emotions will take control. If we allow food that produces addiction, the appetite will become a chain around the soul. But if we guard our diet, we guard our spirit. If we choose what nourishes rather than what stimulates, the inner man strengthens. And when the inner man is strong, the flesh loses its power, lust loses its voice, anger loses its grip, and addiction loses its influence. There are foods that do not harm your body, yet they deeply affect your conscience. These are not dangerous because of their ingredients, calories, or appearance, but because of what they mean to you spiritually. Your conscience is the inner compass that God placed within you. It warns you, corrects you, guides you, and alerts you when something is not right. When your conscience is clear, your spirit becomes sharp. When your conscience is polluted, your spiritual senses become dull. There are foods that threaten not the body, but the purity of this inner compass. Everyone has convictions, quiet, subtle inner feelings that tell you what is right and what is wrong for your spiritual life. Two people can eat the same food, but only one of them feels their spirit troubled. Why? Because the issue is not the food itself, it is the conscience. God uses your conscience to protect your spirit. When you violate that inner warning, even in something small like food, your spirit loses sensitivity. You become less alert, less aware of spiritual danger, and less able to hear God clearly. A polluted conscience creates spiritual confusion. You begin to feel distant from God without knowing why. Prayer becomes harder. Worship feels shallow. You sense heaviness, guilt, or inner conflict. Many people think they are under spiritual attack when in reality they ignored their own conscience. Every time you silence that inner voice, you take one step away from spiritual clarity. What pollutes the conscience is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply unnecessary, unwise, or not aligned with your spiritual growth. There are foods you may feel convicted about, but others do not. This is because God deals with each person according to their calling, their weaknesses, and their spiritual sensitivity. For someone who battles addiction, certain foods that trigger those urges can pollute the conscience. For someone battling lust, foods that stimulate heat in the body can cause guilt or agitation. For someone trying to grow in discipline, overeating or eating certain indulgent foods may cause inner conflict because it goes against the desire for purity and self-control. When you eat something that violates your own conviction, you are not merely eating, you are wounding your conscience. The conscience is like a mirror. When it is clean, everything is clear. When it is smudged or foggy, the reflection becomes distorted. Polluted food, spiritually speaking, is anything you consume that fogs the mirror of your conscience. It can be food eaten in secret because you know it does not align with your spiritual goals. It can be food you feel guilty about afterward. It can be food tied to past sin, unhealthy habits, or emotional wounds. It can be food someone pressured you to eat even though your heart said no. It can even be food connected to old behavior patterns you are trying to escape. When you eat against your conviction, your spirit becomes unsettled. The discomfort does not come from the food, but from the inner violation. The spirit grieves when the conscience is ignored. A believer cannot walk in authority with a troubled conscience. A troubled conscience steals peace. It steals boldness. It steals clarity. It steals joy. It steals the ability to stand before God without feeling internally divided. Once the conscience becomes polluted, the enemy takes advantage. He whispers guilt, shame, and discouragement. He magnifies the mistake. He uses the open door of inner conflict to weaken your spiritual confidence. But the pollution did not start with the enemy. It started with ignoring the gentle warning inside you. That is why protecting the conscience is so important. It is your spiritual alarm system. When you eat something that violates your conviction, you are turning off your own alarms. There are also foods that pollute the conscience because of what they represent in your life. For example, food eaten during emotional distress, stress eating, binge eating, eating to numb pain, creates spiritual heaviness because your spirit recognizes that you are turning to the flesh instead of turning to God. Your conscience reacts because it knows this is a substitute for comfort that was never meant to satisfy the soul. The food may not be sinful, but the dependence is. The emotional meaning behind it pollutes the conscience. Another example is food tied to old bondage. Maybe you used to indulge in certain foods during sinful lifestyles, parties, addictions, or destructive habits. Even if the food itself is harmless, the association carries spiritual residue. Eating it brings back old memories, old emotions, or old desires. Your conscience feels disturbed because your spirit detects a return to something you were freed from. Ignoring that discomfort is dangerous because it reopens doors that God closed. Some foods pollute the conscience simply because they hinder discipline. You know you should avoid them because they weaken your self-control. You know they affect your mood, your focus, or your spiritual sharpness. You know they tempt you to indulge more than you should. But when you ignore that conviction, the conscience becomes dull. Every small violation makes the next violation easier. Over time, your spirit becomes numb, and you no longer feel the same sensitivity to God's voice. A pure conscience is one of the greatest spiritual strengths a believer can have. When your conscience is clean, prayer flows easily, worship feels powerful, the word comes alive, you feel light, peaceful, and spiritually alert. You discern danger quickly, you sense God's presence naturally, you walk with confidence because there is no internal contradiction. Protecting your conscience is protecting your spiritual life. Anything you eat that creates guilt, heaviness, inner conflict, or spiritual discomfort is dangerous, not because of its physical effect, but because of its impact on your inner purity. The moment your conscience becomes polluted, your spirit loses sharpness. The moment you ignore conviction, you weaken your spiritual senses. The moment you silence that inner voice, you open the door for confusion, doubt, and spiritual noise. Guarding what you eat is not about legalism. It is about clarity. It is about alignment. It is about protecting the temple of your body and the sensitivity of your spirit. When your conscience remains pure, your spirit remains strong. When you honor that inner voice, you walk in spiritual authority. When you respect your conviction, you protect your destiny. Spiritual strength is not measured by how much a person knows, how loudly they pray, or how passionately they worship. True strength is revealed in discipline, the ability to choose what feeds the spirit over what satisfies the flesh. One of the greatest battles in a believer's life is the conflict between physical appetite and spiritual discernment. Appetite demands satisfaction now. Discernment looks at the long-term spiritual impact. Appetite pulls a person toward comfort. Discernment pulls them toward purpose, and the one you obey becomes the one that rules your life. Every person has appetite, cravings, desires, impulses. Some are natural and harmless. Others are loud, aggressive, and spiritually dangerous. Appetite wants control. It doesn't want to be denied. It doesn't want limits. It doesn't want restraint. When it is fed frequently, it becomes a master. When it is starved, it becomes silent. The danger is not the appetite itself, but allowing it to become stronger than your spirit. When physical hunger overpowers spiritual hunger, spiritual sensitivity begins to fade. When cravings drown out conviction, discernment becomes blurry. When indulgence replaces discipline, spiritual clarity begins to die. Discernment is the ability to sense what cannot be seen with the natural eye. It is the whisper in your spirit that warns you before danger comes. It is the inward tug that tells you when something is not right. It is the inner light that helps you distinguish between what is permissible and what is spiritually harmful. Discernment protects you. It guides your steps. It strengthens your inner man. But discernment cannot flourish in a life dominated by physical appetite, because the noise of cravings silences the voice of the spirit. There are moments when discernment tells you not to eat something, not because the food is bad, but because it is not good for your spirit in that season. There are times when discernment tells you to step away from certain foods because of how they affect your emotions, your focus, or your purity. There are days when discernment tells you to fast because your spiritual senses need sharpening. There are seasons when God calls you to greater discipline because of the spiritual battles ahead. But if appetite has the final say, discernment becomes powerless. A person cannot walk in spiritual authority while being ruled by cravings. Authority requires mastery over the flesh. Authority requires clarity of mind. Authority requires a pure conscience. Authority requires a sharp spirit. When appetite rules, these qualities diminish. The person becomes easily distracted, emotionally unstable, and spiritually inconsistent. They cannot hear God clearly because the flesh is louder than the spirit. They cannot resist temptation because their will has been weakened by indulgence. They cannot rise in spiritual power because their appetite keeps pulling them down. Discernment is not just a spiritual gift, it is a lifestyle. It is choosing what strengthens your inner man, even when your body protests. It is saying no to good things so you can say yes to better things. It is recognizing that not everything available should be consumed, not everything permissible is beneficial, and not everything enjoyable is harmless. Discernment is the ability to see the unseen connection between what you eat and what you become. The body processes food physically, but the spirit processes it emotionally and mentally. When you feed the flesh recklessly, you weaken the spiritual filter that keeps you aligned with God. Physical appetite is loud, but discernment speaks softly. The voice of the flesh demands, the voice of the spirit guides. Appetite wants pleasure, discernment wants purity. Appetite wants immediacy, discernment wants eternity. Appetite pushes you to follow feelings, discernment pushes you to follow wisdom. The conflict is constant, and the outcome is determined by the daily decisions you make. Every time you choose discipline over indulgence, you strengthen the voice of discernment. Every time you ignore discernment to satisfy appetite, you strengthen the flesh. Many people pray for spiritual growth while feeding their appetite more than their spirit. They want clarity but live in indulgence. They want power but lack discipline. They want purity but ignore conviction. They want spiritual authority but refuse to deny the flesh. But spiritual growth requires sacrifice. It requires cutting off what weakens you. It requires choosing what benefits your inner man, not what pleases your outer man. Discernment grows in an environment of obedience and dies in an environment of indulgence. There are foods that dull your spiritual senses, not because they are evil, but because they consume the energy your spirit needs. After eating too much, prayer becomes heavy. After indulging carelessly, worship feels distant. After ignoring conviction, the word feels dry. A sharpened spirit requires a disciplined body. The two are inseparable. When you train your body to listen to your spirit, your discernment grows effortlessly. But when you train your body to follow cravings, your discernment becomes weak and ineffective. Spiritual discernment is greater than physical appetite because it sees what appetite cannot see. Appetite sees flavor, discernment sees consequences. Appetite sees the moment, discernment sees the future. Appetite sees satisfaction, discernment sees spiritual health. Appetite pleads for pleasure, discernment pleads for purity. The wisest believers are those who learn to follow discernment even when their appetite protests. They understand that the battle is not about food, it is about authority. Whoever controls your appetite controls your decisions. Whoever controls your decisions controls your destiny. Your spiritual sensitivity grows when you honor your discernment. Your inner peace grows when you treat your body like a temple. Your authority grows when you refuse to be mastered by cravings. Your spiritual clarity grows when you choose purity over pleasure. Discernment elevates you. Appetite attempts to enslave you. The greatest victories are often won not in public, but in the private moments when you choose what feeds your spirit over what satisfies your flesh. The wisdom behind these truths is simple but deeply spiritual. What you allow into your body affects far more than your health. It touches your mind, your emotions, and the purity of your inner life. Some foods carry spiritual contamination because they are connected to darkness. Others awaken lust, anger, and addictive cravings that make the flesh stronger than the spirit. Still others disturb the conscience, creating inner conflict and weakening your spiritual sensitivity. Each of these dangers reveals one consistent message. Your spiritual life cannot flourish if your appetites remain unguarded. Your body is not just a physical vessel. It is a spiritual instrument meant to carry clarity, purity, and strength. When you protect what enters it, you protect your ability to hear God, to walk with authority, and to stay sensitive to the movements of the Spirit. Every choice you make in the natural realm has a consequence in the spiritual realm. Discipline strengthens discernment, purity strengthens sensitivity, self-control strengthens spiritual authority. Your journey requires more than prayer, it requires alignment. More than desire, it requires discipline. More than knowledge, it requires obedience to that still, small voice within. When you learn to choose what nourishes your spirit instead of what only satisfies the flesh, you rise into a level of clarity, peace, and spiritual power that the enemy cannot touch. Your destiny is too great, your calling too precious, and your spirit too valuable to be weakened by what you consume. Guard your body, guard your conscience, and guard your discernment, and you will walk in a freedom, strength, and purity that keeps your spirit sharp and your life aligned with the purpose you were created for.